Joining us is senior investigative reporter Ken Klippenstein, otherwise known as Kenny Clips. So Ken, welcome back to the show.
Great to be on.
All right, you broke a story called "The Military is Monitoring Interfaith Groups Opposed to Child Separation, Leak Doc Reveals." So first of all, what's the document you got your hands on now?
So a brave individual within the Pentagon provided me with a document that showed that the military, pursuant to President Trump's border deployment of the military, remember he declared a national emergency over undocumented immigration. Surprise, surprise, the military is collecting intelligence not just on the migrants, but the documents show also to various religious groups that wanted to peacefully demonstrate against things like ICE facilities. And one term that pops up in the documents was anti-border wall extremists, which I thought was a pretty funny term.
I didn't know that there was a spectrum of people who are against the border wall, and that they're like moderate anti-border wall people. They'd like some wall, but not all wall. And apparently there's the anti-border wall extremists. What is their position? No wall? Is that what makes them extreme? What makes them extreme?
Well, some of the groups that are referenced in the documents, and I embed those in the story, I would encourage readers to look at them, describe, I mentioned the Interfaith group. I think the plurality, there were a bunch of different religions represented, including Lutherans, lots of Jewish folks. I think that was the most common group there, and various other Christian denominations. And as far as I could tell, this group seemed like not the scariest bunch. It seemed like a lot of, there were parents, there were younger people, and they just wanted to, nonviolently express their opposition to President Trump's immigration policies, and also to a military base that was being used to detain migrants that were being deported.
Okay, let me see if I understand this right. Let's take the two religious groups you mentioned one by one. So Jewish groups that have gotten together and saying, hey, we remember when previous generations of Jews tried to come to this country to escape the Holocaust, were denied entry. So we want to help immigrants because we understand their pain. Never again. So we're actually going to stick up for other people, and that's why we're against this wall. That our government finds those people dangerous.
Yeah, and what's amazing about it is if you look at the documents, I have what's called, they have some kind of reports it's called a threat assessment. And so they list different threats. And next to this interfaith group were things like drug cartels and
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and trafficking operations and things like that. So it's crazy that they're, equating these different groups. But this is what the civil liberties experts were warning us would happen when the military starts operating domestically like this.
So I don't think anybody who watches this show is confused about my views on religion. I'm 100% against fundamentalist religion. But I also often talk about how some religious folks are the greatest people on the planet. So in this case, the Jewish groups and also the Christian groups. So the Christian groups say, I'm gonna do what Jesus instructed me to do. I'm gonna take care of my fellow man, and I'm gonna stand up for them. Now, Ken, is the government, this is a funny thing to ask, but you've got sources inside these things. There's a reason why they're presumably leaking to you, because they're bothered by this, right? But I wonder if inside the FBI and inside these different governmental organizations, do they have any idea of how biased they are? Because if you said to them, hey, let's infiltrate a Christian right church, because we think right-wing ideology is dangerous, so let's just monitor them and see what happens. My guess is heads would explode. They'd be like, what? You're infiltrating a church, a beloved church. But you want to infiltrate a Christian group or a church if they're left-wing? Oh, great, yeah, of course, they're a danger. They want to help other people. Are they even aware of that monstrous bias that they have?
Well, I should say that in the stuff I've covered, there's perhaps the most dissension with respect to the immigration policy, not just because the military itself is extremely diverse, but also because many people themselves have, family and friends that come from migrant backgrounds. Without commenting on, my source in particular, because I know a bunch of different folks at the Pentagon, overwhelmingly, people seem to regard this mission as idiotic. That's a term that's a word that I specifically heard used repeatedly by different individuals, including conservatives. So I would say that this policy in particular is unlike many of the others. Now, what you're saying is true. There is a sort of bubble within the intelligence community where they become so accustomed to working in secret and in secrecy that even if they might come into it, sort of skeptical, by the time you've been doing this for some while, you kind of accept some of the presuppositions of what it is you're doing. But I would say that people aren't feeling great about the border mission generally.
Right.
All that being said.
So now, I don't want people to get confused. I mentioned a number of different governmental groups, and we have broken stories from those groups as well. In this particular case, it's about the United States military. And so the document that Ken got is a commander's update briefing from August 1st, 2019. So in that briefing, Ken, they also mentioned non-religious groups. Who were they?
They mentioned what they describe as anarchists, which that can be variously termed. I think that can be inclusive of Antifa. They also describe protesters going to the border wall who they think might pose a threat of violence. And if you look at the definition of violence, this is different than the peaceful religious groups. They may try to, according to the DoD, dismantle parts of the wall or do things like that. But there was never any inkling that they might pursue violence against people, humans, individuals. So I would say that what's interesting too is that there are questions posed within this threat assessment. And the questions were, what is the threat from anarchists? What is the threat from anti-border wall extremists? What are the threat from protesters? And when you pose it like that, it looks like the Pentagon is being tasked with producing threats. I mean, you're expected to come up with answers to these sort of intelligence questions. And, if that's the question, I imagine that's going to affect how they perceive things.
Yeah, there are no such things as anti-border wall extremists. There are no faith groups that are even a low-level threat. They are a no threat. But when you have a hammer, everything looks like nails. So that brings us to Mike Pence. So he has said, and you've got it at the end of your piece, that, quote, it's inconceivable that there are not people of Middle Eastern descent trying to sneak into our country, presumably through caravans, etc. So is the military being used for wild goose chases of trying to find Middle Easterners crossing the border from Mexico?
Well, this is one of the most sort of darkly comic aspects of the documents, I thought, was that it showed that the military is actually conducting assessments of the migrant. You remember the migrant caravan, so-called. They were looking at the caravan and trying to tell using whatever intelligence methods they did. It's not entirely clear from the documents, to see if they had been penetrated by foreign intelligence services, including counterterror groups. So, we all hear someone like Pence say something like that, or Trump, and we laugh it off. But I should say that segments of the military and of the intelligence community, whether or not they believe it, have been tasked with carrying these things out and taking them seriously in some respects. So I think it would be wise to sort of take leadership at their word, and not necessarily just because they're maybe sound silly right off that may have some concrete policy impact.
So let me get this right. The Russians interfering in our elections and possibly having connections to the president, not a concern. But Middle Easterners infiltrating Honduran refugees, giant concern.
Yes.
I mean, look, it's so outrageous that we laugh at it, but we're wasting, not only are we wasting taxpayer dollars on this nonsense, but now we're infiltrating the groups that are perfectly peaceful and based on political ideology. So look, I don't think, maybe I shouldn't conclude that. I was gonna say, I don't think it's as bad as the J. Edgar Hoover days, but it certainly reminds you of those days when they would do this on a regular basis. So, I mean, are we headed back? Does it look like, at least in this administration, we're headed back in that direction?
Well, I quote in the story a legal expert, because national security, intelligence, these are all very complicated matters that you have to understand, very complicated sorts of case law to be able to tease out and comment on knowledgeably. But what this individual with the Project on Government Oversight told me was he himself compared it to J. Edgar Hoover, at least in the sense that nonviolent groups are being monitored, and in this case, not even by the FBI, which is obviously Hoover, but by the military. And there are supposed to be all sorts of rules against the military operating on domestic soil because it's understood that that has a negative effect on democracy.
And by the way, is also illegal. But I guess we just don't have laws in this country anymore. So, okay. And it's remarkable. I mean, people can't pay attention to this stuff nearly as much as they should. This would be a giant scandal in any other administration. The problem is they break so many laws with such great frequency that it's hard to keep up. But Ken tries anyway. So everybody check out tyt.com/investigates. This particular story we'll have as a link down below in the description box if you're watching later on YouTube or Facebook. But you can go to tyt.com any day to check out all the stories from our great investigative reporting team. Ken Klippenstein, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Great to talk to you, Cenk.
On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcast.